Will you please be seated? Would you bow your heads and pray with me? Pour out your Holy Spirit upon us that we may hear your word and have the strength to do that which you call us to do. Amen. Phil read for you from the book of Samuel, and usually, if you're anything like I am, you go to sleep when we're going to read the Old Testament. And therein is stated a powerful phrase. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and there were no frequent visions. The word of the Lord was rare. Perhaps there were no ears to hear. And there were no frequent visions because there were no eyes to see them. It was the time of Eli and his sons, debauched priest, philandering priest. And Eli had warned them, but they had not listened. There were no pressing issues in Israel at the time. Oh, there were always those constant ongoing struggles with those Philistines and their fish god Dagon, but no main issues. And Israel falls into life's monotonous rhythm. The word was rare until it came to a small boy. It came to Samuel. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. The people of Israel insisted they wanted a king like everybody else had a king. It was not satisfactory that they lived in a theocracy, a rule of God handed down by the judges and the prophets. No, we want a live, living king. And God said, no, you do not. For you will suffer the day that we are ruled. You are ruled by kings. And the Lord gave in to their request. And soon the kingdom is split in two. The northern Israel, the southern Judah, now two kings. And on we read in the book of Kings, and the king did evil in the sight of the Lord. And on it went, debauched kings, philandering kings. Uzziah had come upon the scene and offered a little hope of being a good king, but then he became proud and arrogant. And the scriptures say God smote him with leprosy. I don't want to get into that theology. And then it was the year that King Uzziah died that a man unexpectedly, Isaiah, saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the whole temple. And from that experience we had 66 chapters of prophetic literature in our Old Testament. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Gone were the days of Israel. It had been 500 or 600 years since Israel had known self-rule. They were occupied, a captive people. And it had been hundreds of years since the word of the Lord had come to them. Judaism had been reduced to following the prescription of following a book the Torah, or maybe the prophets. Of course, they couldn't agree amongst themselves which one was actually to be in the Bible, just the first 5, or the inclusion. And they thought about such things. And they had broken down the law to a point where it was putting upon the common folk heavy burdens, too heavy for them to carry. Like, how many feet could you walk on a Sabbath day and not be breaking the commandment, remember the Sabbath day? You could not heal if it could wait till the next day. They had developed, the clergy folks, a religion of guilt, where the burden of breaking their human-made codes would separate them. At least they would feel separated from God. Gone were the days where we heard the voice clearly, I do not want your tithe, I want your heart. And when religion becomes codified, rule following, the God of mercy and justice is pushed to the perimeter of religion. The word of the Lord was rare in those days, and then it came from an unexpected place, from an unexpected person. A voice of one alone crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. And then along came Jesus from Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? A no-count, piddly, squat little village known for nothing. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days, and the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. The war had been over for decades. The slaves had been emancipated. Yet the melody of mine eyes had seen the glory of the coming of the Lord were just fading into the background and memories of the people. The reconstructed South, it seems, had constructed other things, invisible walls between the races. Those, slaves who were liberated had two choices: to stay on the land and work the land and become sharecroppers, one slavery for another, or move to the north to dwell in the cities where they received no help or encouragement, and lived in the ghettos. And I can remember even until the 1980s in Greenwood, Mississippi, that county seat in Mississippi Delta, that a white Anglo-Saxon doctor could not practice medicine on an African American, or the community would ostracize. The only one MD available to the African American in that county was a nun. Some spoke words that said the key for our plight is education, and they received this response: separate but equal. They got the separate part right, but there was no funding for the equal. It was a genteel way, a southern way of saying, don't cross this line, stay in the back of the bus. Ross Barnett of Mississippi and George Wallace of Alabama tried to stop desegregation at Ole Miss and the University of Alabama, respectively, and were charged. But they never paid their fine nor served time in jail. These are the times of Catherine Stockett's the book, The Help. Not a few of you have come and said, have you read the thing or seen the motion picture? And not a few have said, I am shocked at the way they treated The Help. I was not. I graduated from a college right down the street where much of that was filmed in Jackson, Mississippi. I lived there in the 60s. And the irony of the segregationists, the outspoken and the silent, is that they ended up in a church every single Sunday. Ross Barnett graduated from Mississippi College, a Baptist institution. It doesn't mean Baptist. It would have happened at a Presbyterian one in the South. The word of the Lord was rare in the Southern churches. It stood to reinforce segregation. Separate, we'd say, separate churches, but equal. And the only churches that were desegregated were the Roman Catholic churches in the South, but they were suspect because they were idol worshipers. That's what I was told. Could people in the churches hear the word when religion is ensconced in prejudices under the guise of personal piety and personal faith? Can they hear? The word of the Lord was rare in the 1950s and 60s in this country, in the South, and yet God raised up the son of a preacher who spoke clearly that all people are God's children, regardless of the color of their skin. And as happens to most true prophets, they are hated, they are despised, they are slandered and imprisoned. I remember reading one sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King, and he says, the title of the sermon, "What Shall I Tell My Children Why Their Daddy is in Jail?" He was accused of being a communist by the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. And yet he frequently spoke against communism, communism being materialism, and there is no hope in materialism. Accused of being an anarchist, yet Dr. King spoke clearly of passive resistance to unjust laws, nonviolence. In April of 1968, he preached the famous sermon that is thrilling to read, entitled, "I've Been to the Mountain." And he says in there, and I quote, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He has allowed me to go to the mountain, and I've looked over the Jordan, and I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we will be there in the promised land. I am happy tonight. I am not worried about anything. I fear no man. For my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." The next morning, James Earl Ray assassinated Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Tomorrow, it might just be for you another long weekend, a free day. But from where I stand, it's much more than that. It is the celebration of the word of the Lord coming from least likely places and through least likely people. It's a time that we might remember little Samuel the boy, or a man just serving his time in the temple, or another coming out of a no-count village called Nazareth, and the one tomorrow coming out of poverty in the slums of Atlanta. You see, tomorrow we celebrate a long lineage of prophets who spoke the word when it was out of season. And they realized the cost of discipleship, and they paid the price. And tomorrow we must ask if the word is being spoken by unlikely folk in unlikely places. If the word is coming to our ears, we must ask tomorrow, can we still hear it? Can we? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
If you're able,